Have you been learning Spanish for a while and you feel like it is still a struggle to string a sentence together? I'm going to let you know why that is, and most importantly, what you can do to become less and less dependent on this so-called need to string a sentence together. Comencemos, amigos. Hola mis queridos líderes del lenguaje, bienvenidos a otro video, o si es la primera vez que tú y yo nos estamos conociendo, te doy la bienvenida. Yo me llamo Erika. Aquí te ayudamos a aprender a hablar español con confianza y a crear una rutina de aprendizaje irresistible a través de las historias y las conversaciones auténticas. Si eso te parece interesante, pues suscríbete para no perderte nada. Alright guys, so language learners often say this about it being so hard to just string a sentence together. And I understand this struggle, I really do. They're usually referring to the difficulties in creating a coherent sentence that's grammatically correct with all of the parts in the right place. But the more that you are able to learn in the way that I'm going to describe to you, the easier and more natural the process is going to be. So we're going to talk about learning in chunks. That's how we learned our first language. When a child, or an adult for that matter, says, I want some ice cream, they're not thinking, okay, the verb is to want, first person singular, I want, and then I'm gonna say some instead of a or an because ice cream is an uncountable noun. No one is thinking that. We learned I want as a phrase, as a chunk, and then learned that we could, add on to that the thing that we were wanting. And then what kind of preposition to use, and if we should use some or a or the, just kind of came naturally through repetition. Our ears started to pick up what sounded right, what sounded most natural. The exact same thing applies to Spanish, even though there are far more conjugations than in English. The verb quiero, no native Spanish speaker is thinking querer, okay, but I'm referring to me, so quiero. No, the word quiero is just a word. There is no conjugation going on in the brain. When I say to you, hola, ¿cómo estás? Mucho gusto. Most likely, you immediately know what I'm saying without stopping to think about every word. Hi, how, you are, a lot of pleasure. You probably really have never thought about the meaning of every single word because you learn those phrases just as a group, as a chunk, and you accept them for what they are. Plus, you've probably heard them a lot of times. That repetition helps as well. So the formula would be learn the language in chunks and then apply a lot of repetition to that. That's going to come through a lot of comprehensible input, through a lot of reading and listening. You want to try to learn as much of the language as possible in this way, in chunks, because it's going to be so much easier to understand it when you hear it, even if it's not enunciated properly, even if it's slurred. Hola, ¿cómo estás? Mucho gusto. Because you are used to what words come after the other, what words should be grouped together. And you, as far as you're speaking, you're going to be able to speak so much more fluently, faster as well, because you're no longer trying to translate every single word from English into Spanish. And as far as you're speaking, the more the language that you're learning in chunks, the faster, the more fluent, and the more correct and natural sounding your Spanish will be. How can you do this? I have 4 tips for you. The first one is notice and accept. Sometimes when you are listening or reading, you may come across a sentence structure in Spanish that's different to you. It's different than English, or it's just new to you. For example, pay attention to the prepositions and the phrases that they form when they are paired with certain verbs or certain adjectives. For example, maybe someone says, siempre pienso en ti. I always think about you. And then you hear someone say, he estado pensando en una idea. And you're like, okay, pensar seems to go with en. We don't express it that way in English. We say thinking about, but okay, this is how we say it in Spanish. Pensar en. Notice it and accept it. Or you may hear someone say, me gusta comer pizza los viernes. And you're like, oh, los viernes. Like in English, we would say, I like to eat pizza on Fridays. We would say on. But in Spanish, we're expressing this thought differently. It's as if we're saying the Fridays, right? So you'll start to notice things like that. The more you're listening, the more you're reading. And when you notice patterns, if you're not sure, you may want to get some verification by doing a little bit of research, by asking your teacher. But once it's confirmed that, okay, this is the sentence structure in Spanish, accept it. And when I say accept it, I mean there's no need to sit and ponder Why? Why is it said that way instead of this way? Spanish is not a translation of English. We cannot understand Spanish always through the English lens. It's a different language. Spanish needs to be understood in its own context. And so when we understand and accept that, then we can much faster just kind of move on, notice and accept, and get to the learnings instead of always wondering why it's this way. And this is another reason why your input needs to be comprehensible, as in you can understand the idea mostly of what you're reading or what you're listening to. Because if it's too hard and everything is just over your head completely, then there's no way to pick up on these little things. There's no way to pick up on these differences in sentence structure, because you just didn't understand most of it anyway. So no matter how basic of an input you need to start with, do that. And then just increase the difficulty as you go along. How are you doing? Are you hanging with me so far? If you've had any kind of aha moments in these few minutes, imagine how much you'd learn in a 1-hour lesson with me. So register for my free workshop, The Next 90 Days, Accelerate to Confident Conversation. It's the most comprehensive Spanish training that you ever will receive to level up your Spanish conversational skills in the next 90 days. You can check that out by going to ericarealanguage.com/90 days or clicking the link in the description box below. Tip number 2, now that you have noticed and accepted a new pattern, try it out. You can do that through something that I call sentence variations. There are a lot of ways to do sentence variations, but let's take that example that we saw earlier of los viernes. Me gusta comer pizza los viernes. So try to see what else you can do, making that day of the week plural and having that stand in for on such and such day. Los domingos cenamos en casa de mi mamá. Los sábados me pinto las uñas. Whatever you can do, okay? Really reinforce that new pattern that you've learned through sentence variations. Tip number 3, never try to memorize individual words. Always give yourself more context. Not only is that going to help you remember those words better, but it's going to get you used to thinking in chunks instead of individual words. And it doesn't take a lot more effort to do this. Plus, it's just way more fun. Let's try it. As I show you these images, remember the word or phrase that goes with them, okay? We'll start by seeing the image along with the word or phrase. Casa. Comer. Fines de semana. Desafiante. All right, I'm going to show you those images. Can you remember what the words were? All right, did you remember? Casa, comer, fines de semana, and desafiante. If so, excellent. Now I'm going to show you those same images, but try to remember a whole sentence, including that original word that goes with it. Okay? Vivo en una casa grande. Me gusta comer pizza los viernes. Ella siempre está feliz los fines de semana. Mi trabajo es interesante y desafiante. Okay, all right, let's see how you do this time. Image number 1. Did you remember? Vivo en una casa grande. All right, image number 2. Me gusta comer pizza los viernes. Image number 3. Ella siempre está feliz los fines de semana. Image number 4. Mi trabajo es interesante y desafiante. All right, how'd you do? If you've been studying Spanish for a little bit of time and these words were familiar to you, then perhaps you were able to recall all of the sentences or most of them, since we were using very common words, except for desafiante. That one may or may not have been new to you. So just think about it. If you can take your new word and create a sentence with it, using other words that you already know, it's going to make it easier to remember your new word. And also, all of that sentence structure in between is going to start to stick better, and you're going to be able to take that general sentence structure in between the vocabulary words and use it in other sentences. You won't even know where it came from. From that sentence, ella siempre está feliz los fines de semana, you may find yourself saying things like, él siempre está enojado, yo siempre estoy cansada. You won't even know where that siempre está came from, but it came from somewhere in the past where you were learning things in chunks and not just individual words. Finally, use your habit that you've now formed of learning in chunks to learn idiomatic expressions, which 100% have to be learned in chunks because they often make no sense if you try to break down the words individually. Take the expression no tener pelos en la lengua, literally not to have hairs on your tongue. But what it actually means is to be straightforward or to tell it like it is. Mi amiga no tiene pelos en la lengua. Let's recap. To apply this method of learning in chunks, the first thing that you need to do is notice and accept new patterns that you find through your comprehensible input. And you need to be consuming a lot of Spanish, so a lot of comprehensible input. Number 2, experiment with those new patterns that you learned through sentence variations. Number 3, try not to memorize individual words. Always give yourself more context. Number 4, use your habit of learning in chunks to learn idiomatic expressions. And when you learn one, try to use it as often as you can that day or that week. It'll help it stick a lot better. Now, I want to point out that it is unrealistic to think that even when you're trying to do your best to learn in chunks, that you're never going to have to think about a sentence and you're never going to be translating in the moment from English into Spanish. That's going to happen. It'll happen less and less the more that you learn, but it's still something that's just normal. It's natural. It's nothing to feel upset about. But the more that you can get used to learning in chunks, the more naturally the Spanish is going to flow from your lips, and the less you'll have to rely on direct translation. I hope that was helpful, guys. If so, give me a like. That lets YouTube know, hey, I should show this video to more people. And if you want to go beyond just the little tips like this and you want the full A to Z plan of what you should be doing to seriously take your Spanish to the next level, then don't forget to join me on my free workshop, the Next 90 Days Spanish Workshop, Accelerate to Confident Conversation. I'll see you there. In the meantime, no te olvides de salir y vivir una nueva experiencia con tu nuevo idioma hoy mismo. Hasta la próxima.